Okay, so I want to go over with all of you the relief the relief lecture. All right, see if this works. Okay, so some of this we already talked about, some of this you already know, but just as a quick recap of what we've already discussed. Relief printmaking produces a reversed image, so obviously you want any sketches you do to be in reverse, especially if you're doing any text. The flat surface or wood or linoleum is what gets printed. So it's the reverse of the intaglio process, where in intaglio the flat surface gets wiped. Here the flat surface gets the ink. All parts of the design that you don't want to print get carved away. The plate is inked and then transferred to the paper. Lines and shapes that are remaining will hold ink and will be printed onto the paper. Like intaglio, the print is made using direct pressure from the press. The plate is in direct contact with the paper. However, you can also hand print a relief, which is pretty much impossible with intaglio. So, and that's what we will be doing at home. We will be hand printing. And you don't need as much pressure to create the print as you would with intaglio. So Linocut is what we're doing, which uses linoleum as opposed to more traditional wood. It's much easier to carve, but it has a very similar aesthetic to the woodcut. It doesn't have the knots. It's softer, it's more flexible, so all of those things make it a lot easier to work with than wood. The technique itself isn't much different. You still carve away the areas that you don't want to print, and the flat part that remains is still the part that receives the ink. Kandinsky and some expressionists engraved on linoleum. Matisse was fascinated by its ease in working and used it in the simplest terms possible, creating a series of engravings of pure white lines on a black ground. Picasso also used linoleum to do a number of colored linocuts between 1958 and 1964. So where did relief printing start? We believe woodblock prints originally were used in 8th century Japan for printing text, and then around the 17th century they began using relief printing to print on fabric as well. And I encourage you to try printing your Linocut on fabric. It can be a really fun thing to do. They do sell relief inks specifically for fabric, you know, that will last through washing. So here are some images, more historical woodblock prints. When designing your woodblock, remember that having even areas of block exposed will help for even inking. Large vacant areas often hold ink where it's not intended. So what that means is if you carve away a very large area without leaving any texture in that area, sometimes what happens is the brayer or the roller that we use to ink the block will slip down into that carved area and you'll get ink on there. If you have large areas of block to carve out, you might consider adding a border or leaving texture in that area to keep that brayer above the surface, the carved surface. So this should look familiar to you. This is what you've all been working on, using the tool to go in and carve. When you first start with that tool, you usually want to start at more of an angle to get that tool into the linoleum, and then you kind of lower the tool so that it's at less of an angle with the block as you move the tool across the linoleum, of course moving it away from your fingers. And then these are the steps here. So here's the carved block on the left. In the middle, that's the brayer or the roller that's used to ink the block, and only that raised flat surface is getting the ink. And then the paper print next to it shows that the image has been reversed. So when it comes time to ink the block, and we'll be looking at some videos of this as well, you want to scoop out your relief ink as you would with etching ink. Being careful, or you want to squeeze it out of your tube. Most of you will be using tubes. So you'll want to just squeeze out a small amount and put that on a piece of plexiglass. which you should have from the kit. If you don't have a piece of plexiglass, you could use, there's other things that you could use, and we can talk about substitutions of things you can use if you don't have a piece of plexi. So you're going to want to mix the ink a little bit with your palette knife just to make sure that it is soft, and then you're going to, with your palette knife, you're going to want to spread it out into a line on your plate. So you start by making a line, and then your roller, your brayer, will come across that line back and forth. I like to go in two directions, not making the area too large, to spread out the ink. And you can see it goes from being really thick at the top there to the area that you roll out starts to have a very velvety consistency, and you kind of hear this little noise that we call the kiss, which is that kind of crinkle noise that it makes as it goes across once the ink isn't too thick on your surface. So this is what it shouldn't look like. Really goopy and really wet. That is not going to give you even inking. Here's some examples of various brayers. So in a full print shop, you would have many different sizes of brayers, from smaller ones for small sections up to very large ones for inking very large blocks. So you want your brayer ideally to be about the size of your matrix or your block. If it's too small, then it's going to take a very long time for you to ink it. If it's too big, it's going to be really unwieldy. So approximately the size of your block. So if you have a 5 by 7 inch block, using a 4-inch or 6-inch brayer is perfect. If you're going to be doing multiple colors in different sections, then you can use a smaller brayer for those individual sections. Printing a woodblock. So original woodblocks, 1400, 1450, were inked, and then the paper or fabric was laid flat and the ink block pressed down onto it. So more like a stamp. Rubbing. This was the original method in Japan and China, and was then later used in Europe, and many of us will be going back to doing this now that we're printing from home. So the inked block is placed face up, the paper or fabric is laid on top of the block, and then you rub on the back of the paper or on the paper using, oh, sorry, this is actually describing traditional inking, but we are going to be doing a different kind of rubbing, so not to be confused, like me. Okay, so traditional hand inking, where you're going to be inking the block, ink block is face up, you put your piece of paper on top, and then you burnish the back of that piece of paper. And burnish is basically a word that means that you're pressing down on the back so that the ink transfers from the block to the paper. Traditionally, you would use something called a Baren. But at home, you can easily use a wooden spoon, works really well, or even a metal spoon. Anything that's smooth and either flat, or even better is that it has a slight curve to it. That's why like a wooden spoon works, like a wooden cooking spoon works really well, or even a metal spoon from the kitchen works really well. And then of course you can use a press when we're in the print studio. And then rubbing being what we might be doing at home, which is basically, as opposed to truly printing it, putting a piece of paper on top of the surface and then putting a piece of, taking a crayon or other drawing material and rubbing across the surface to expose the image that way. Alright, so here's just a couple examples of Barens that are available that you could use for hand printing. And this is just basically a diagram that shows A represents the block with the carved areas removed, the black ink on the top, and then B represents the piece of paper picking up that ink from the flat surface. And some examples. These are the ones that we did look at in class already, but always nice to look at them again, especially as you're carving. Sometimes it's nice to see what others have done. You can see how values have been created by removing either larger areas or smaller areas of linoleum, and you get a lot of texture and value as well. When carving your block, you want to think about the balance you're creating between the white and the black. If you leave too much black, meaning you don't remove enough linoleum, it can feel really incomplete. And vice versa, if you remove too much linoleum and leave very little black, it also can feel a little incomplete. So having that balance, it doesn't have to be a 50-50 balance, but you do want to think about having a nice balance between the black and the white. And you can see here how different artists have done that in many different ways. Adding texture is a huge part of creating a relief print, and the way you use your carving tools, the different shape of tool that you use, whether you make a long cut or a short cut or a curved cut or a diagonal cut, that's all going to change the way the texture appears in the print, and it's going to make for a much more interesting print, and it also will help you create value. For those of you that are familiar with drawing terms, with cross contour lines, you'll notice in these Alejandro prints how he uses cross contour lines to shade the objects, and that adds a lot of volume to the images. You see how the curved, how the area is removed, how those hatch lines curve around the form. Those are the cross contour lines. They add a lot of dimension. Of course, to get any of this amount of detail, you have to, one, be incredibly experienced, have a lot of practice, and also have a much larger working area than we have. What we're looking at now are very large prints. And there you can see the scale of them. And there he is working on one of his wood blocks. Pretty amazing. Okay, that's not your assignment, so we'll end on that. Okay, hope that helped, and there'll be some videos to follow up. Not sure how to turn it off. Oh my goodness. Where'd it go?